The Miami Dolphins finished the 2024 season with an 8-9 record and missed the playoffs for the first time in the Mike McDaniel era. It was an incredibly frustrating year as they started the year 1-0, then had quarterback Tua Tagovailoa get injured in the second game against Buffalo, and eventually had a 2-6 record through 8 games. They won 6 of their final 9 games to improve the record, but it was all for nothing. They had a chance to get into the postseason entering Week 18 as they needed a win over the Jets, plus a Broncos loss to the Chiefs backups, but as we know, that didn't happen as Denver would go on to beat Kansas City 38-0 in Week 18, while Miami lost by double digits on the road to the Jets. And even if the Dolphins got into the postseason last year, it should not be a controversial take to say this team would have probably been one and done in the playoffs. And 2024 was a very long season for the Dolphins for several reasons, and unfortunately, I don't think it's going to get better, at least significantly, anytime soon. And in today's video, we're going to break down why the Miami Dolphins are in an impossible situation. We're going to break down how we got here, what the realistic steps are moving forward, and what the outlook is for them for the next few years. Now let's begin. And we are starting today's video by discussing what the Dolphins' biggest need was heading into the offseason, and it was undoubtedly trench play, and more specifically, the offensive line. The biggest contract signing they made in free agency was bringing in former Steeler and Bear James Daniels on a 3-year, $24 million deal, and I like this signing because it's pretty much the definition of a low-risk, high-reward contract. Daniels unfortunately tore his Achilles in Week 4 of 2024, and that prematurely ended his season. And Daniels has had above-average years since entering the league back in 2018, so if he can play at an above-average level, the way he has in years past, then this will prove to be a steal for Miami, and if he doesn't, then there is an out in the contract after 1 year, and it's essentially no harm, no foul. And to give you an idea of how important it was for Miami to address the offensive line, they could not run the ball they wanted to last year, and due in large part to this, they essentially added the quick pass as an extension of the run game. And to show some numbers to back that up, per PFF, Tua had the lowest average depth of target of any NFL quarterback who threw at least 100 passes in 2024, with an average depth of target of just 6.1 yards. Gardner Minshew was second at 6.2, and Patrick Mahomes was third at 6.9. Tua also had the average fastest time to throw at just 2.3 seconds, with Cooper Rush in second at 2.35. There was a substantial gap between Cooper Rush and Kirk Cousins, who was third, as Kirk's average time to throw was 2.54 seconds. And for reference, the 0.19 seconds between second and third place between Cooper Rush and Kirk Cousins is the same difference between being third on this list and 19th on this list. Meaning, the Dolphins' passing game last year was a ton of behind-the-line-of-scrimmage throws to try and generate yardage that the run game could not, at least consistently. And despite missing 6 games, more than a third of the season, Tua finished 5th in attempts behind the line of scrimmage in 2024, as he had 105 passing attempts behind the line of scrimmage on just 435 total passing attempts. So, needless to say, the Dolphins needed to address the offensive line in a big way, because no matter what was said about the offensive line last year by any member of the Dolphins, good or bad, those numbers say quite a bit without anything being said. And not only that, but the Dolphins also went from averaging 5.1 yards per carry in 2023, which was first in the NFL, to averaging just 4.0 yards per carry in 2024, which was 28th in the NFL. And why I think the Dolphins are kind of in an impossible situation is it's difficult to replace one offensive lineman per offseason, let alone multiple, at least with quality players. And that's kind of why they were forced into taking a chance on a player like James Daniels, who is coming off of a major injury. Not only that, but they are also gambling on 2024 second-round pick Patrick Paul, due in large part to the Teron Armstead retirement, to be their left tackle in 2025, and there's not much more to say other than it's exactly that. A gamble. And generally speaking, I'm not a fan of gambling on project players, especially with a unit that struggled in a big way the Dolphins did in 2024, and kind of assuming that because he has his rookie year out of the way, that he will naturally get better. In theory, that could happen, but I don't think their starting right tackle in Austin Jackson is particularly great in any area of his game, and heading into a big season for your franchise with question marks at the tackle position is already not a good sign of things to come. And not only that, but I'm not really sold on any of the other Dolphins offensive linemen either, at least not to the level you'd want for a team that internally has playoff aspirations. Now, entering the 2025 draft, the Dolphins needed offensive line help in a big way, and that's unfortunate for two reasons. Typically, when you need offensive line help, it's because the offensive line played poorly the year before, or you had several players leave in free agency and or retire. The Dolphins had both, as Teron Armstead retired, and the offensive line did not play well in 2024. That is unfortunate, of course, but the other big reason as to why it's unfortunate is because every other NFL team knows you need offensive line help entering the draft. Obviously, teams pay attention to what other teams' needs are, so if they need to trade up to go get a player, and they can trade directly in front of another team who may potentially select their guy, that happens a lot, and that was a case of the Miami Dolphins in the 2025 draft, where everybody knew they needed an offensive lineman, and it was also unfortunate for Miami that the board did not break their way in the first round. And the reality of the NFL draft, and ultimately the NFL, is teams typically do not let good offensive linemen leave the building. If you ever wonder why some linemen get top 2 or 3 money at their position, despite maybe being the 6th or 7th best guy at their position, it's because it's a lot easier to pay a guy top 2 or 3 money and to slightly overpay them rather than try and replace them with what could be the 27th or 30th or 35th best player at the position, even if it is at a fraction of the cost. So when you factor all of this in, and then you also throw in the fact that the board did not break in favor of the Miami Dolphins, and why this is unfortunate for Miami is because the top 3 linemen in this class in Will Campbell, Armand Membu, and Kelvin Banks, all of whom would significantly help the Dolphins' offensive line in 2025 and beyond, were not available when they were on the clock. I do think it is also worth noting that Tyler Booker was selected directly in front of the Dolphins. However, I don't think Miami would have selected Tyler Booker, due in large part to his lack of mobility as an offensive lineman, and I think Miami would have wanted a more mobile offensive lineman, which is kind of the player they selected in the second round in Arizona offensive lineman Jonas Savaiinaea. And what was also unfortunate for the Dolphins regarding the 2025 draft is because the board didn't break their way, they ended up taking Kenneth Grant at number 13 overall, the defensive lineman from Michigan. And I do like Kenneth Grant. I think he can be a solid player at the NFL level, but I also think it's fair to say that he is not the 13th best player in this class. For reference, I had him around player 26 on my board, and because the offensive linemen that were drafted ahead of Miami and the offensive linemen that were drafted after Miami's 13th pick didn't exactly fall their way, and that they weren't selecting again until pick 48 in the second round, they were kind of forced to trade up from 48 to 37 so they could go get Jonas Savaiinaea. And they traded quite a bit for Savaiinaea, as they traded a second round pick and a 5th round pick for pick 48, pick 98, and pick 135, which left a significant gap for Miami as they selected Savaiinaea at pick 37 and did not select again until they selected Jordan Phillips from Maryland at pick 143. Having that big of a gap between your second and third selection in any draft is not ideal, and in a lot of ways due to this, it's kind of a two-man class in Kenneth Grant and Jonas Savaiinaea, both of which players I thought were overdrafted. I was a little lower on Savaiinaea than the national media, as I didn't think he was particularly dominant at either guard or tackle during his time at Arizona, but I do acknowledge there is guard-tackle versatility, and that in theory, he should be an improvement upon the Dolphins' offensive line and what they fielded regularly in 2024. And the brutal reality of the NFL draft is how fast everything happens in real time. Before Miami could look up, 2 of the 3 best offensive linemen in this class went to division rivals, and the 3 best offensive linemen were gone. And depending how you view Travis Hunter, the 2 best receivers were gone as well, as he went number 2 to the Jags, and Tetairoa McMillan went number 8 to the Panthers. I also want to acknowledge that this is not Madden where you can just field trade offers and that you can really fleece teams based on the board, and that you could have acquired another team's second round pick for moving back 3 simple spots in the middle of the first round in a weaker draft class. I think there is a reality where Miami really wasn't offered anything for pick 13, so they were kind of forced to take a player, and that player ended up being Kenneth Grant, who fills a position of need despite not necessarily being the 13th best player in the class. And what has to be remembered in real life is it always takes 2 to tango, and the reason we bring that up is because a lot of the time, if the board does not break your way, the way it didn't for Miami in 2025, is fans will just say, hey, no worries, no big deal, we'll just trade back and we'll acquire a lot of draft capital. But if there's nobody that teams want to trade up for, guess what? You are sticking at your pick and you are selecting a player that may not fit the value, and that's exactly what I think happened with Kenneth Grant. And there was a bit of an offensive line run towards the end of the first round as Donovan Jackson went to Minnesota, Josh Connerly went to the Commanders, and Josh Simmons ended up going to the Chiefs. So that really kind of forced Miami, and ultimately Houston's hand for that matter, if they wanted to go up and get an offensive lineman, both teams which desperately needed it. And that kind of goes back to why I think Miami had to overpay to go get a player in Jonas Savaiinaea, who I don't think is all that good to begin with, but they didn't really have a choice because it was either Jonas Savaiinaea or a third or fourth or even fifth round prospect to pick 48, and that kind of forced GM Chris Grier's hand to overpay with the Raiders. And for a team like Miami, who I would kind of consider to be a no man's land, where they're obviously not going to be a 2 or 3 win team, and they're certainly not going to be a 15 or 16 win team, in order to get out of the middle of the hump or even slightly above average, you really need things to break your way in the draft each and every year. And unfortunately for Miami in 2025, it didn't. And they only had 2 top 100 selections and ultimately 2 top 135 selections. And this all plays into why I think the Dolphins are kind of in an impossible situation. Now, why the Dolphins are also in an impossible situation applies to their defense too, and one thing I do want to be clear is they're not a bad team, obviously, and in fact, they've done a lot of good things over the past few years, and drafting Chop Robinson was one of them. Chop was a 21-year-old pass rushing prospect from Penn State, and in his rookie season had 56 pressures and 6 sacks, and with the year both Quinyon Mitchell and fellow pass rusher Jared Verse had, naturally Chop didn't get a lot of love from the national media, and at this point, I believe he will be a very good player for a long time for Miami, and that this draft pick was by every definition a home run, and good for Miami, truly. But aside from Chop Robinson, they have Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb at the edge rushing position, and that's a really good position to be in as a franchise, while also having Zach Sealer get after the quarterback too, who I do believe is one of the more underrated players in all of football. But where my concern lies with Miami's pass rushing situation is health. Jalen Phillips unfortunately tore his Achilles in 2023 and tore his ACL in 2024, and obviously we wish him the best, but those are 2 brutal injuries to come back from as a pass rusher, and ultimately at a position where explosiveness is crucial to your success. And I don't want to go down the road of saying neither Chubb nor Phillips is going to be the same player they were pre-injury, because that is absolutely not what I'm saying, but I do think they need to prove they can stay healthy and produce close to the level they were pre-injury before I start believing in them again. And I will say, in the best case scenario, having all 3 of those guys along with Zach Sealer and even rookie Kenneth Grant is phenomenal, and there's a lot of teams that would love to have those guys. But where I really worry with this team is secondary. Obviously everyone has heard about the Jalen Ramsey trade rumors for a while, and while the 7-time Pro Bowler and future Hall of Famer is a very good corner, he will turn 31 in October, and that's definitely worth noting because the corner drop-off is going to happen at some point, and it's a matter of when. And also, for the sake of the 2025 Dolphins, if they trade him, that makes things significantly worse in the short term because their top 3 corners would be Kader Kohou, Cam Smith, and Storm Duck. And needless to say, I would not trust the Dolphins' corner room no matter how good their pass rush is. And obviously a good pass rush is important, and I do believe a healthy Dolphins team would be one of the better teams at getting after the quarterback in 2025, but I also think it's fair to say, for how good their pass rush can be, their corners are equally worrisome, especially if they trade Jalen Ramsey. I would have liked the Dolphins to address corner in the draft or even free agency more than they did, because this is a team that desperately needs corner help. And this next point applies not just to the Dolphins, but to really any other AFC team too, and it's that you can never have too many corners in today's era. And the unfortunate part for Miami is, for as much as I love their pass rush, when healthy I have as many questions or concerns at the corner position, which in some ways kind of cancels out how good the pass rush for them is. And when you are in a division with not just Josh Allen, but also Drake May, a player who I believe is also on the rise in a big way, and a team in the Patriots who just had a great 2025 draft, my question is, how much better did the Dolphins really get this offseason, and how many steps did they take in the right direction towards the ultimate goal, which of course is winning a Super Bowl? And to me, the reality is, I don't think they're that much closer to getting to a Super Bowl, much less winning a Super Bowl, than they were 4 or 5 months ago. Yes, they made a couple of improvements to the roster, as I think James Daniels is an upgrade, Kenneth Grant in theory is an upgrade, and so is Jonas Savanaia. But are those the missing pieces that are going to get us from 8-9, 9-8, 10-7 to 14-3 or 15-2, and to beating the Buffalo Bills when it matters? This team a couple of years ago played the Bills with the division on the line, and to what should have been nobody's surprise, Buffalo beat them when it mattered, and that's, to me at least, going to be the reality of the Dolphins situation moving forward. They selected Tua in the first round of the 2020 draft, and in theory, this is the 6th year of the rebuild, and they have 0 playoff wins to show for it, and quite frankly, I don't know how they're ever going to get their first playoff win unless they play a team that is derailed by injuries, or unless they catch a significant amount of breaks throughout the course of a game. This team has 2 playoff appearances in the Tua era, one of which was quarterbacked by Skylar Thompson, and they lost in Buffalo, which was to be expected from a 7th round quarterback, and the other was in Kansas City in the 30-degree below zero game. There's also a $200+ million elephant in the room that we haven't discussed yet, and that's Tua's contract. I do not think Tua is a bad player, and I don't think anybody seriously thinks that Tua is a bad player. They may not think he's a top 8, 10, or 12 player at the position, which is completely understandable, but he's certainly not a top 3 or 4 guy at the position either, and I don't think he will ever be a top 4 player at his position in the conference. Now, when you have the Mahomes, Allens, Burrows, and Lamars of the world, and those are the guys you are going to have to get through with Tua as your starting quarterback to get to the Super Bowl, and I don't think that's ever going to be a reality for the Miami Dolphins. Tua is a guy that needs help more so than other quarterbacks. Obviously, there is a baseline of help in which every quarterback needs, whether it be the offensive line or receiver play or running back, you get the point. But Tua, because of how limited his game is athletically, needs more help than other quarterbacks. And the reality with the Dolphins roster right now is their offensive line isn't great, and there's a lot of uncertainty around Tyreek Hill at the receiver position. And as much as I like the idea of Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, I don't think he's going to be an 80 or 90 catch guy that they can just seamlessly insert into the offense and not have to worry about the receiver position other than Jalen Waddle. So when you sit back and ask the question, how can we get the Miami Dolphins, a team that wins anywhere from 8 to 10, maybe 11 games in a year and is a wild card round exit, to beating the big brothers in the conference, whether that's Baltimore, Buffalo, Kansas City, and a team that is also on the rise, in my opinion, the New England Patriots, from where they currently are? And to be completely honest, I don't have a good answer to that question, and this all plays into why I think the Miami Dolphins are in an impossible situation. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, as it helps the almighty YouTube algorithm and is very much appreciated. I cannot thank you guys enough for the support, and until next time, please be safe and have a great day. Love you guys.